Thank you for inviting me. I'm really very excited to present you my work today. So this is going to be, I guess, a bit of a different paper than you are used to because it's a mix of like history, labor, and well-being.
Martin, could you speak up or put your mouse nearer the screen or something?
Yeah, I'll speak louder. Yeah. So let me motivate this paper with the events that took place in Chile in 1970s that are the setting of this paper. So in 1973, you had a military coup in Chile that revoked the previous progressive government of Salvador Allende. There were many changes in the 1970s, many reforms, both in the economic sphere, but also on the educational side. And in 1981, there was a major educational reform that introduced a system of school choice and vouchers to finance all public and subsidized private schools. So what happened immediately is that in a few years, there was a massive increase in the number of private schools and also in the share of the students that were enrolled in this type of institutions. Now, not everybody went to these new private schools. There was a compositional effect. That is to say, only mostly children from middle-class families and from wealthier families made the move from public to subsidized private institutions. And as a result of this, there was a sharp increase in school segregation. Now, 30 years later, 3 decades later, what we see is that the private sector in education plays a major role in Chile. So we have more than 50% of students enrolling in in subsidized or private schools. And this is one of the largest figures among OECD countries. And not only that, because of this compositional effect that I described you, because of children from wealthier families attending these private institutions, Chile is one of the countries with highest levels of school segregation. So what I'm doing in this paper is that I'm evaluating the long-term effects of this 1981 educational reform. And we will be talking about segregation or the stratification that the reform induced on the basis of socioeconomic status. So it's not based on race like in many other studies. The main outcome that I'll be looking at will be a broad measure of subjective well-being, a life satisfaction question. And by long run, I mean 3 decades after being exposed to the reform. So this is, in a sense, the effect of being exposed to school segregation during your childhood. So how that's gonna materialize later on in your adulthood. So the empirical approach that I will use is that I will have a measure of your exposure to this voucher reform depending on when you were born, when you started school, and then a proxy of the intensity of this reform using the rise that we saw in private enrollment in the years following the reform. Why Chile? Well, there are a couple of advantages of this setting. First, it's a developing country with extreme levels of school segregation today. So in terms of public policy, it's very important to understand what have been the consequences of this reform. And secondly, because this rise in school segregation has a clear marking point with the introduction of this voucher system, this provides a unique quasi-experimental setting to analyze this type of questions. What do we know about school segregation and how it could be connected to subjective well-being? Well, there is a number of pieces of research that has shown that school segregation may hurt minorities, for instance, reducing their educational attainment, increasing the probability that they engage in crime, and also having negative effects on earnings, health, and social mobility overall. There is also some evidence that being in segregated schools in terms of race lowers the probability of interethnic or interracial marriages. Also more positive evidence that moving to richer neighborhood may have some modest effects on well-being and health on the long run. Other research on education has shown that actually segregating schools or having more homogeneous groups in class could have some benefits in terms of facilitating teachers to adapt the level of the course and eventually having positive effects on performance. And there is evidence as well that segregated schools in terms of gender may also increase educational attainment. Then there is another dimension that we could think as relevant, and is that when we think about segregation, we need to bear in mind that is key for the type of contacts that you will have and the type of a circle and network that you may create. And this is directly connected to other aspects such as social comparisons, the quality of your relationships, and perhaps your feeling of belonging to a particular group. Very good. So let me now move. I'll have a very standard outline. So let me give you some background about what this reform implied so that you can understand better what happened and what could be driving the effects. So before the reform in the 1950s and 70s, the main objectives of the Allende government were to increase the capacity of the educational system, building schools, and improving also quality, so investing resources in education. Then in the 1973, we have the military cap that as a short-run effect, what it implied was a cleansing of many teachers and principals who may have been thought of being like progressive or socialist. So there was like a cleansing of these principles in schools, and there were also some modifications of the curriculum. Moreover, the unions of teachers were also dismantled. So we saw an improvement of the conditions of teachers. But in terms of how school choice worked, there were not significant changes. Now, at the time, there were three types of schools: public, subsidized private, and fee-charging private schools. Public schools in the 1970s and before enrolled around 80% of students. They were monitored by the Ministry of Education, and they were receiving transfers based on total enrollment and previous costs. And almost all of them followed the national standard curriculum. Subsidized private schools, they were mostly run by Catholic and Protestant institutions, and they were also receiving transfer from the government, but they were severely underfunded and they were relying on their own resources. Importantly, at the time in the 1970s, these subsidized private schools, they were not selecting students and they were not charging tuition fees. So they comprise around 15% of students. And finally, we had these traditional private schools that were meant for the elite. This was like top quality education, highly selective, and they were admitting mostly children from the wealthiest families and enrolling around 5% of the total student body. So the key takeaway here is that before the reform, most children attended the closest school to their homes, and this could be either a public or a subsidized private schools, this type of religious schools, and they were receiving education and a curriculum, a very similar curriculum, and they had peers of all type of social background, right? Only these children, some of the wealthiest people and going to these elite schools were having this like sort of like excellent group of peers. What happened then with the reform? What are the origins of this policy? Well, we could think of this under the ideas of Milton Friedman and competition, right? So the idea about vouchers was that if we finance schools equally, both public and private, there could be competition between them to attract students, so that to increase the revenue through the student vouchers. And this ultimately could lead to, well, improve the quality of education and at the same time reduce the cost, right? So the idea behind the vouchers was to have public and subsidized private schools competing between each other to attract students and hence to increase their funding. So here we have two pictures of the key figures of the moment. Augusto Pinochet, who was the leader of the regime in Chile after the coup, and then on the right, the Chicago boys, these economists who studied in the University of Chicago and who brought many ideas about how to reform the country and to increase flexibility, reduce regulations, and promote competition in different sectors. The main idea then of the reform was to give higher flexibility to the schools and to increase competition between them so that they could both increase educational achievement and reduce the cost. So the financing was the same for both subsidized and subsidized private and public schools. So now they will receive a fixed amount of money for every school, for every student they were enrolled. So there was a flat per student subsidy, and this would make all the financing of the school. Importantly, you had freedom to attend any public or subsidized private school you wanted, right? So there were not preferences. You could attend any type of school. There was free choice. And subsidized private schools were not allowed to charge tuition fees. So they were meant to admit everybody. There were also some changes in terms of higher flexibility and decentralization of the schools, but unless you have questions later, I won't get into many details. So the essence was that now the financing was much higher and there was this flat per student subsidy, both for public and private subsidized private schools. What happened then? Well, in only 5 years, the number of subsidized private schools in the country doubled. It went from around 1,500 schools in 1980 to close to 3,000 schools. Now, the number of public and traditional private schools remain overall quite constant over the period. Similarly, the number of students enrolled in this type of institutions also rise. So from around 15% in 1981 at the time of the reform to over 35% at the end of the 1980s, and then it plateaued, it remained constant at the time, right? So as an immediate result of the reform, we see this sharp and large increase in enrollment in this type of subsidized private schools. So you can see it in this other graph that is just representing the yearly change in enrollment. So the first year after the reform, the number of students in subsidized private schools increases by 30%. And then there are other increments, but at the end of the decade, we reach that plateau. There's a lot of variation in the country, and this is the type of variation in enrollment that I will be exploiting in my analysis. So you have the share of subsidized private enrollment in 81, in 88, and then the change between those two periods. Something important, as I mentioned earlier, there was this selection into subsidized private schools that were very connected to income. So here in this graph, you have different income deciles and the share of students attending private schools, both subsidized private and elite schools, and you see this linear relationship. So the higher the income of the family, the higher the chances that their children will attend a private institution, and you see also that middle-class families are those who are the most likely to send their kids to this type of institutions. So this is based on 1990 data.
Can one ask you to explain why that might be so when they're not allowed to charge fees?
So that's my next question, right? So in a couple of slides, I'll explain you why this was happening. So just to give you more direct evidence that there was this direct relationship between these subsidized private schools and school segregation, in this graph, you have the share of students who are attending, well, on the y-axis, private enrollment, and on the horizontal axis, the ratio between the income of parents with kids in public and private schools. And as you can see, this relative income measure, so the gap is changing as one increases private enrollment. So the higher private enrollment is in a community, the largest is going to be the gap between the income of families having their kids in private and in public schools. If you do it across provinces with the data in the 1990s, you have a very similar pattern. So whenever you have more students attending subsidized private schools, there is a larger gap of income between the representative family attending public and subsidized private schools. So why was the case, right? As research asked, why was that happening if there was free choice? Well, there was free choice in theory, but not in practice. So what was happening is that because it was profitable to have children from a better socioeconomic background, because they are cheaper to sort of like educate, because they will perform better, they will attract new students and so on, subsidized private schools had an incentive to cherry pick and to try to attract the best students, right? That would make life easier for the teachers, and they would make them seen as more competitive schools, making them earn higher profits. So these new schools, located strategically in richer areas within municipalities so that they could attract middle-class students. So we observed that they were mostly locating in urban areas, and also they were locating in the better off neighborhoods. So you could have free choice, but to the extent that a given subsidized private schools is farther away from your home, that would increase the cost of you to attend that school. Secondly, we can think of the information and the preferences of parents. So lower educated parents may have had less information about what was the quality of the schools, or why they should send their kids to a faraway school. Actually, there were strategies of the schools per se to try to disencourage certain families for applying there. So they would have interviews with the parents. They would have also, well, request some documents like a certificate of parental income, or have additional classes that would require a payment. So they try to create a scheme students through different ways, like requiring uniforms. At the time, even if it was not allowed, very soon they started charging fees. So what we see is that at the beginning of the 20th century, in the 2000s, more than 50% of the students in subsidized private schools declared having been subject to some form of selection. And by the way,
does it include academic selection?
Yes, so that could be academic selection. Actually, students could even be expelled from the school if they misbehave and so on, something that wouldn't happen in public schools. And actually, from a reform in 1993, both public and subsidized schools, because they were severely underfunded because of the school voucher system, they were allowed with this new law to charge tuition fees. So from the 1990s, you have fees that would even increase much more segregation. So what is the data that I will be using, right? So I will be relying mostly on the National Household Survey of the country, which is called CASEN. And this is the survey that is used to measure poverty and income conditions in the country, and to implement all types of social policies and all type of social programs. So this is a repeated cross-section. I will use the surveys, the ways of 2011 and 2013. Now, the reason for this is that they include a question on life satisfaction, the typical life satisfaction question that is as follows, right? So taking all things together, how satisfied are you with your life these days? from a scale to 1 to 10. All right, so this will be the main outcome that we will be looking at, but I will show you also other dimensions of well-being. The data of enrollment in the schools comes from the archives of the Ministry of Education, and I will be using mostly the year 1981, just before the reform took place, and 1988, when the increase in private enrollment stabilized, right? So the increase that we observe in these 7 years will be my proxy of the intensity of the reform in a given community. So I have the total enrollment in public, well, in the 3 types of schools, but I will be focusing on this subsidized private. And then to enrich the analysis, I will use other type of data from population censuses and other sources that give me information about the share of children in the communities, urbanization, levels of schooling, indigenous populations, and I even have data about repression during the dictatorship, right? Because one could fear that the increase in private enrollment could be related somehow with other aspects of political economy during the time. So the unit of observation will be individuals, but this enrollment data will be at the municipality level, which is around 350 different municipalities in Chile, as I showed you before in the maps. Now, getting this matriculation data was really an odyssey. So it has been used by some authors in the past, but the data was lost. And then I was for more than half a year trying to recover these enrollment records. So it took me like dozens of emails back and forth with over 20 people. I was in Chile, by the way, trying to find this data. So I was talking with Chilean economists. I was talking with the only authors that had used similar data in the past. So eventually, in a municipality in the outskirts of Santiago de Chile, in an old library of the Ministry of Education, I found the original documents of enrollment in all schools of the country in the 1980s. So given that these were school by school, I had to take thousands of pictures, because the original records were in such a bad state, I had to transcribe all the data manually, one by one. That took me over a month of work, just copying data from pictures into spreadsheets, just to have this, like, well, 600, 700 numbers, right? Well, it depends how you want to say, but just to have a couple of thousand numbers, I had to spend almost half a year of work, right? All right, so how I'm going to use this data and how I'm going to try to analyze the long-term effects of this reform. Well, you may think of the strategy as a cohort analysis or a sort of difference in difference, in which I will be comparing different cohorts who were exposed to different intensity of privatization during the 80s. Life satisfaction, again, will be observed today, well, a decade ago, when individuals are in their late 30s, in their adulthood. So the idea is, okay, the year of birth will give me the year an individual enters a school, and that determines the exposure to segregation, because if they enter school in the 1980s, it'll be when the reform is taking place. The municipality of birth, where they were born, will give me the intensity of the reform, because I will have by how much subsidized private enrollment increased in that particular location. So I will have simply a dummy variable, taking the value 1 if the individual was born in the early 1970s, meaning they were around 8 years old when the reform started to take place. And then I will be having as a control group individuals who were born on average 10 years before and who were 18 by 1982. So they were out of the educational system when the reform took place. So this will be my exposure measure. So if you were already too old to be affected, you are in the control group. If you were slightly younger, 10 years younger on average, you are gonna be more exposed. But this is, just to be clear, is very fuzzy, right? Because we may think that individuals may be fully exposed only after some years, or that even some individuals in the control group may have been affected somehow because of spillovers. But this will be for simplicity, this will be the main strategy that I will use. Of course, I also have alternative measures of exposure. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we have the intensity of the reform for an individual. And this will be just the measure of by how much enrollment in subsidized private schools increased between 1981 and 1988. So this is time invariant, this is at the municipality level. So just to give you the graphical intuition, so we have these early cohorts that were born in the early 1960s and then out of the educational system. So these are not exposed. Then we will have other individuals who are partially exposed. That will be my treated group. And of course, everybody who was in attending a school after 1988 at the peak of the increase in school segregation, we could consider those people as fully exposed. Why I don't rely on these late cohorts? Because the more I get farther away from these individuals born in the 1960s, the more likely it would be that there could be some age cycle differences behind the results and playing a role. So I would always prefer to compare like individuals who were as close as possible to each other. All right, so this is the main estimation equation. I will have life satisfaction of an individual I from a cohort C and a municipality of birth J, and then I will have fixed effects for the municipalities. So I will always be comparing individuals who are in the same municipality. And then I'll be interested by the interaction between being exposed to the reform, capital E, and the intensity of the rise in subsidized private enrollment, which is capital T. I will also have some individual controls and some other variables at the municipality level that, well, depending on that capture trends. So they will have different values depending on which cohort, in which cohort you are. Right? Importantly, you have a question, Richard? You are mute, I think. I cannot hear you because you are mute. And I don't know how to, can I unmute you? No. I don't know if somebody can unmute Richard because I think he has a question, or at least he was moving his lips. Because I cannot hear you.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, now
I was saying, where does age come into this?
So
is it in the controls, but obviously age is also related to history.
Exactly. So that's a very good question. So I will have age. So in the individual controls, I will have age, right? Think that I have two waves of the survey, 2011 and 2013. So that means that I will have individuals that are born in the same year. Well, I will have individuals who, depending on the survey in which, well, I will have age is collinear with the year of birth, right? So at some point, I will have this. Sometimes I have some robustness checks in which I include this exposure to the reform dummy, right? That is based on your year of birth and hence on your age. And I will have other analysis in which I will exclude this measure completely, and I will have age or birth of year fixed effects, right? But we are always interested in this interaction, right? In the interaction of when you were born that determines your exposure and how much private enrollment increased in during your childhood. I will have some, maybe I'll show you then some robustness checks after my main result that perhaps answer some of your concerns about the role of age. If you have any other remark, feel free to ask. But yeah, I only have these two ways of the survey, right? So the year in which you are interviewed gives you the age, and your year of birth. So I cannot play too much with age when you are interview and the year of birth because they are collinear. Now, something central is that because of this pattern of selection into private schools, depending on family income or socioeconomic status, I will be running this regression separately for different levels of what I call family background. And this will be a measure of status that relies on parental schooling, on parents' education. So for individuals, I will look at the distribution of parents' schooling in their province, and I will rank them, and I will classify them into different categories as low, medium, and high family background. So essentially, low family background will be individuals with parents at the bottom 40% of the schooling distribution in that area. Individuals with medium family background will be sort of like the middle 40%, and those of high family background will be the top 20% of the schooling for parents. So I will be running separate regressions for these three groups. And here are the main results. So what I find, we will remember we care about the interaction coefficient, right? How much every percentage point increase in private enrollment would affect the exposed individual. So overall, what I find, as shown in column 1, is that the reform didn't have any impact on life satisfaction 30 years later in adulthood, right? The coefficient is very close to 0 and insignificant. Now, when we separate individuals in column 2, 3, and 4 according to family background, what we find is that individuals from lower family background with lower educated parents were negatively affected by the reform. So this coefficient is a beta coefficient, so it's in terms of standard deviations. So what it's showing you is that if we take a 10 percentage point increase in subsidized private enrollment, these individuals would see their life satisfaction falling by around 6% of standard deviation. Now, from high family background individuals, we find a positive influence, around 4% of standard deviation for every 10 percentage points of increase in subsidized private enrollment. Are these effects small, big?
Martin, are you taking questions as you go?
Sorry?
You're happy to take questions as you go?
Yeah, of course. Please go ahead.
You're running these regressions separately, which means that the controls, including the municipality controls, are not constrained to be the same, right?
No.
Could you not easily run one regression and just have an interaction between the FB group and your main coefficients of interest?
Exactly. So I could do that. I think I've done that, but I don't remember precisely what that yield. But absolutely, I could do that.
So doesn't this capture sorting? Or maybe I've forgotten what the FB group is, but couldn't you have an interaction between location and the FB groups?
No. So the thing that the FB group is something. So I think it's important to remark this is based on your parents' education, right? So,
but not within your municipality, but for the whole country.
No, within your municipality.
Yeah, right. So then we could be seeing an effect that's actually to do with sorting, geographic sorting.
Yes. But I'm going to show you results separately about individuals who move or not, and that's going to be something central.
Okay.
Yeah, and all the controls, just to highlight this, all the controls are predetermined variables as well as family background. So things that are measured before the reform took place. So overall, these effects are quite sizable. So if you want to compare this 6% fall in subjective well-being, this is equivalent to a decrease in household income of around 25%, or a decrease in schooling of more than 1 year of education, which is 1/3 of a standard deviation in education. So these are very sizable effects of the impact of increasing subsidized private enrollment. Here I run a battery of robustness checks. So I include individuals controls. This is the cohort fixed effects actually are like controlling flexibly for age, the municipality fixed effects, other controls at the municipality level, and trends from the population censuses. And if you focus on the odd columns, which is the results for low family background individuals, you see that they range all the time between 0.005 and 0.006. So whether you include different variables, different controls at the municipality level, or whether you include different trends that you could observe in those municipalities as controls, don't seem to change much the results, at least for the group of low family background individuals. Now, I'm going to show you two exercises that I think that may rule out many concerns that you may have about the empirical strategy. And the first one is to actually compare different groups of cohorts to sort of like a fixed control group. So I will be running multiple regressions in which the control group is always individuals who were born in the 1950s. And then I will be considering individuals as treated for every single window that you can think of thereafter. So this graph is actually plotting you the coefficient of the main interaction effect between being exposed and the rise in private schools, right? And we are sequentially comparing individuals born in the early 60s, 61 to 65, 62 to 66, 63 to 67, to this main control group born in the 1950s. And what you observe is that we only find a sizable negative and significant effect of this interaction coefficient when we compare individuals who were born in the early 70s or thereafter, right? So this is one alternative way of giving validity to the strategy. So there is something going on. If there is something going on that is causing the results, it has to be something that happens at the same time as the rise in private schooling, because only individuals in the early 70s, born in the early 70s, are being affected by this rise in subsidized private enrollment. An alternative way of doing a similar exercise is by comparing cohorts that are very close to each other instead of 10 years apart, as I was doing before. So again, I will be running multiple regressions and plotting the coefficients. So I will be comparing, say, individuals born from 1960 to 65, and that would be, for instance, the control, to 65 to 1970, right? So always adjacent cohort windows. And what you observe here is that there are never big and large and significant differences between adjacent groups of cohorts in this whole window, only when we consider individuals born in the early 70s against in the late 60s. So there is something going on. There is something that is that is measured by the rise in private schooling that is only affected the cohorts that we would expect to be affected. What are in particular the individuals being influenced by the reform? So now I will be looking, as you said, Chris, separately at those who move or not during their life, those who live today in the municipality in which they were born, and those more likely to have been exposed. And I will also be looking at men and women separately. So if you focus on the first two columns, you can see that the coefficient is very similar for both women and men, but in the case of men, is not significant. It's less imprecise, it's marginally significant. So, but these two coefficients are not statistically different from each other. In the case of high family background individuals, only men seem to have been affected. And importantly, when we look at individuals who today live in their birth municipality, what I call stayers, or individuals who move, we observe that only those who actually today are living in that same municipality were hurt by the reform. If you move, on average, those individuals had not been affected for whatever happened in their childhood. Maybe they moved very early on, or they moved when the reform was taking place. But what we observed is that they were not affected in the long run. So to wrap up these results, both men and women are affected similarly, but those who seem to have been hurt among low family background individuals are those who stay in the municipality of birth. Now, imagine that you move. What would happen if you move to a municipality in which there was also a large rise in private enrollment? Well, that's what I'm doing in the last two columns. So instead of using the rise of subsidized private enrollment where you were born, I'm using as the main variable the rise in the municipality you live today. And this coefficient is showing you that if you happen to move to an area of high privatization, you were also hurt. But that only happens for these low family background individuals. So if you were low family background, if you have low educated parents, it doesn't matter whether you move or you stay in your birth municipality. If there was a large increase in private education, you were hurt in the long term. I don't know how I'm doing in time. Well, I'm almost done. So
you
now
have a bit more than 10 minutes, so you're doing really
fantastic.
well.
Very good. So I'm going to do the same type of a strategy now, looking at different outcomes instead of life satisfaction. And this may help us to illuminate a bit on the underlying mechanisms that are driving these effects. So I will be looking at aspects such as health, so self-reported health in a scale, income conditions and employment, and also patterns of movement to urban centers and other demographics. Again, looking separately at individuals from low family background, those hurt, and those from high family background, those benefited by the reform. So what we observe is that individuals who were more exposed to privatization today live in households with a slightly lower household income. So a 10 percentage point increase in subsidized private enrollment has led to around 3.5 percentage points lower family income. We also see that these individuals tend to work less hours. So again, a raise of 10 points in private enrollment leads to around 1.2 fewer hours work per week. And we see, I don't know if one should interpret this as something positive or negative for your well-being, but we also see that private enrollment increased the chances of these individuals to be married compared to the control group. Among the high family background individuals, we don't see much in none of the outcomes besides hours work. So again, we observe that these high family background individuals were more likely to work for extended hours if they live in an area that experienced a lot of privatization in the 80s.
Martin, can I please have a quick question about this one? So there are standard errors in parentheses, right?
Yes.
And in this row where you have your scroller now, so your standard errors are larger than the coefficient, but your coefficient is mapped as significant.
So perhaps there was like an error with the
Yeah, so yeah, the one for household income and for single. So we look at stars, not at standard errors, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So perhaps there, because the standard errors, I had to do like a sort of like a computation to adjust them for this like multiple hypothesis testing, and perhaps I screw up in the code then to sort of like, but yeah, the stars.
Okay, so we're looking at stars.
They come directly from the package, and the standards I had to recalculate them. Thank you for that. So there are other mechanisms, other channels that I have also examined that would speak more directly to these potential consequences of segregation. So assortative mating, the type of partner that you may have that may be quite in the school in which you studied. Also social comparisons, income comparisons, and also the potential effects on inequality. So regarding assortative mating, what I've done is that I constructed some measures of how similar the two members of the couple are in terms of their schooling, their income, and also their parental schooling, right? So I've constructed a sort of gap between them. And then I've run the same type of strategy using these measures as the main outcome. However, I don't have any evidence that this rise in private enrollment affected somehow these levels of assortative mating measure as the gap in these outcomes in the couple. I've also explored the potential role of social comparisons, constructing measures of reference income, which is nothing but the average income of people similar to you in terms of their age, the location in which you are, and family background. And then doing a triple interaction between the exposure measure, the rise in private enrollment, and this reference income. And I haven't found any evidence that these income comparisons measured in this way could drive the results. And finally, I've also calculated some measures of income inequality at the municipality level and interacted with the measure of exposure and intensity of the treatment. And again, this triple interaction is not significant. So it doesn't seem that somehow there could be an interplay between the reform and inequality. Of course, there are many other mechanisms that could be behind the results. We could think that the voucher reform not only increased school segregation, but also led to sorting in the municipalities, like across neighborhoods, that could then have an influence on subjective well-being. There could be differences in access to other public services beyond the schools, such as hospitals or schools today, actually. So if you are a parent deciding where to send your kid, you may still be suffering the consequences of what happened in the 1980s in terms of privatization, right? So, also, the quality of your relationships and your pool of friends may have changed, and this is very difficult to capture with the data that I have. We may think about individuals also reflecting on what the dictatorship and these privatizations reform imply, and perhaps this having an influence on how they see society today, how they see fairness, inequality, and how they react to different issues in the country, right? So they may react to a persistent high level of school segregation today in the community and react more than those who didn't experience that when they were a kid, those who didn't suffer this disruption. And finally, there could be other social comparisons beyond income, or still income comparisons that played a role in a different manner in which I've been analyzing them. So let me wrap up, summarizing some of the main findings of this study. So I've shown you today strong evidence that this 1981 voucher reform had a negative long-term effect on individuals who were coming from low family background with well-educated parents. On the contrary, individuals with highly educated parents seem to have benefit, but only to a lower extent, only modestly. I've also shown you suggestive evidence that these low family background individuals tend to work fewer hours and also enjoy lower levels of household income as a result. But again, one has to explore more in depth these and other potential mechanisms. So I think that there are three main takeaways of this analysis. The first one is that when we try to analyze public policies, and in particular educational policies, we cannot focus only on young outcomes because their potential effects may materialize later in life. You may not observe truly an effect, a measurable effect during childhood, but perhaps in adulthood, individuals start to suffer. So we should evaluate policies, evaluating the gains and the costs through the entire life of individuals in order to do a cost-benefit analysis. Secondly, it's not enough to look at educational outcomes It's not enough to look at the schooling or at earnings, right? If we want to understand fully the consequences for well-being, we need to rely on broader measures. Subjective well-being is a very good candidate. And finally, you may think, or at the time there was this idea that, you know, this voucher reform improved things. So we may agree or disagree whether the technicians wanted to have a good impact, but in theory, you know, they wanted to increase learning and reduce cost, right? So I think that if we believe my results, they highlight that sometimes well-intentioned public policies, they may have unexpected effects if they are badly designed, and these negative effects entail large losses of social welfare. Now, because we have a lot of bad news recently, we've been 1 year under a pandemic, I want to finish on a positive note, and is by telling you about what's been going on right now. So 3 decades later, 5 years ago, to be precise, a new educational law was approved in Chile. It's called Ley de Inclusión Escolar, a law of school inclusiveness or inclusion. And the 3 main features of this new regulation is that now public and subsidized private schools cannot longer charge fees. So they cannot longer charge tuition fees, so that to counteract these composition effects. Schools can no longer have a for-profit orientation. So the only goal of the schools now should be educational success. And finally, they are trying to limit selection by introducing a lottery system so that it could provide equal chances to all children to be admitted in no matter what the school. So it's perhaps too early to evaluate the potential effects of this reform, but hopefully they may counteract some of the negative impacts that the voucher school of 1981 had on individuals' well-being. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you so much, Martin. We have a bit of time for a few questions. So if somebody wants to jump in, it's the right time. Well, while let me jump in then. I was wondering, so you observe people at 2 waves at 11 and 13. So you have their life satisfaction at different age, right?
Yes.
Do you think it's somehow, and you cannot control for age, obviously, because it's absolutely linear with the cohort. Do you think there is, like, it somehow is interacted with the results? Like, did you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that when I compare, so I've done an additional exercise in which I compare cohorts at different distances between them, right, of increasing age, right? And actually, as in some of the robustness that I showed you, it doesn't really matter for other groups that should have not been directly exposed to the reform. So to me, it's a bit like if age was playing a role, it would be surprising that only for we only observe an effect of private enrollment in the 1980s for actually the individuals who were born in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. I think that in that sense is reassuring. Now, I would love to have more waves and to be able to play differently with the potential influence of age. I'm planning to do that looking at other outcomes. So actually, so I'm sort of like torn between having this project as it is, focusing on well-being, or being like a broader evaluation of the long-term effects of the reform. If I was to include more waves, I could look into more detail in different outcomes such as health, income, schooling, and so on. So that's sort of in my head, in my to-do list, to enlarge the data set to look at different periods.
Thank you.
Could I ask, I mean, is really what you're saying that it's beneficial to the individual to go to a subsidized private school. And that these effects are coming about because of the increase in the availability of that for the high socioeconomic groups. In which case, I mean, have you tried running this equation for individuals' well-being on the left-hand side, on what school they actually attended on the right-hand side, and then using the availability of such schools locally as the instrument to pick up the exogenous element in what school they attended?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic suggestion. Unfortunately, in this survey data, only children report to which type of school they are attending. So these adults, I don't know whether they attended a private or public school. So I agree that that's unfortunately that's a limitation. But I may be able to find other survey data in which adults report to which type of schools they've reported, perhaps with or without life satisfaction data. Something that I could do is that I could look at places in which there was a very large increase in subsidized private enrollment. So almost for certain, those individuals may have attended those schools, and areas in which no new school opened up. So in that sense, I will be comparing two extremes, but I will be more certain that I'm picking up precisely individuals who remain attending public schools and others who almost for certain shift.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So I'm sure Martin is happy to accept questions later in case anybody has it. Yeah.
Send me emails with any comment or suggestion, and I'm also happy to have a virtual coffee or chat with all of you.
Great. And next week, we're going to have Kaspar Kaiser, who's going to talk to us about using memories to access interpersonal comparability for wellbeing reports. So hope to see many of you next week. And great to see all you today. Have a nice rest of the day. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.